Amazon.ca is a large portion of the story. It's very important because Ramona works for Amazon. And this is early Amazon. This is 2004 Amazon.
Yeah, this is book delivery.
Amazon. So Amazon is, Ramona skates up. And
she's the one Amazon delivery driver and skater and whatever in like all of Toronto.
Yep. And so she delivers the package and he's like waiting by the door and everything. And, of course I remember the scene from the movie. I told you I was reading the Kindle versions on my tablet, and I'm like going through and reading. And while I'm reading that scene, my doorbell rings. Mm-hmm. And who is it?
It's Ramona Flowers.
It's Amazon. It's Amazon delivering these books to me.
Was it Ramona?
It wasn't Ramona.
Okay.
No. It was actually like my typical Amazon delivery man. But
okay. He, wasn't it like a pink-haired Manic Pixie Dream Girl out there?
No, not this time.
Okay.
But yeah, I thought that was such good like synergy for their company there. Like they must have known that I was on that scene because I was on my tablet.
The chances that would end up being what it is today, Welcome, friends, to episode 172 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Bryan Lee O Malley's 2004 to 2010 comic series, Scott Pilgrim. Hello, James. It's been a little while since we've talked. I feel like you've been busy with work and I haven't been talking to you as much lately, but
yeah,
we log on every week to talk about, adaptations, and here we are with a comic run, which is not something we've done a lot of.
Yeah, and it's fun. I grew up reading comics and I love them to this day. The blending of the visual and the written word is always appealed to me. And I'm like a defender. Like I'm if somebody wants to talk shit about comic books, like I'm ready for a fight.
I feel like comic books are having a moment right now, or have been having a moment. Like, I don't know. Like, I feel like they used to be a lot more like a kind of a second class perception from a lot of, maybe more like literary snobs or something. But I feel like we're at a time where everybody's recognizing them for the artistic merit that they have.
Finally.
Yeah. And speaking of, like, do you have any, did you read this comic
no.
at all before this? Okay. So we both are coming in new to this.
Yeah.
We've only covered a few other comics on here, a couple of Alan Moore ones, and then what else? Oh, Old Guard. And in those episodes... Snowpiercer, yes, thank you. In those episodes, I talk about how I am a complete novice when it comes to comics. It's not something I grew up with. It's not something I read. I was just familiar with what they were, but like I never owned a comic to my recollection. I didn't really have friends who were really into them, so I never got exposed in that way. So this has been a new thing for me, and I've been really enjoying it. And this is just another like piece along that journey. But I am, once again, I want to put my ignorance at the front of the episode as we go into it, because I am not someone who's going to be able to like talk to you about the history of comics and where this lines up and what they're doing with the form necessarily. It's going to be completely kind of a layman's understanding of it.
And I don't think there's any, I think comics are a medium where there isn't like a steep learning curve or anything really. There's a little bit of like getting used to the flow of how a page might go, like panel to panel. But overall, like I think it's fairly a friendly environment, and like I'm happy that you're enjoying yourself. I do want to, we'll talk more about it, but there's a lot of, this is like a comic book, right? So there's a lot of like referencing of other material going on in this, and like we'll have
a lot of which I missed because I would read like, oh, this was a reference to this other comic or to this manga, and like I didn't know what it was. I'd never heard of it, so I'm sure a lot of this went over my head. But yeah, I mean, Andy's referencing films, and there's lots of references because it's very meta, right? Like it's very playful in its construction and its tone. It's a fun comic, and definitely I had a good time reading it. And that seems to be kind of the point of it. Before we get into it more specifically, though, I just want to say this is our final Jukebox Hero project. It's a holdover from last year when we ended up stopping our Jukebox Hero tier on our Patreon. This is commissioned by Stephen E., who commissioned several others, and I hope he enjoys this coverage. We ended up having to put that tier to bed, though, because we realized it just didn't scale. And we wanted to create something that was going to be more sustainable going forward. So instead, we are doing polls now, where if you're at a certain tier, this is our $2 tier, you can vote on polls in addition to getting all of our other stuff. And the polls will be for future projects. And in fact, our very next project is being decided by a poll right now, although I think when this episode comes out, the poll will be closed. But that's how we're going to do it going forward. We're going to try to do it quarterly. We're going to put up several different options, and then all of our patrons who are at the $2 and up tier can vote on those polls. And then that'll allow us to like still have that listener engagement where they're, and people are wanting to choose projects for us, but it'll scale for potentially higher numbers, we hope, whereas if people are getting their own projects all the time, it was starting to become an issue of keeping up with it, honestly. And then we felt bad.
Yeah, and we're also fans of democracy, so
there you go.
Let's let the masses decide.
Yeah, and and it's also a fairly small community right now. I mean, we're hoping it's going to grow larger, but yeah, if you were worried that your vote isn't going to count, like it does, because there's, you know what I mean, like it'll have weight. So definitely check that out if that interests you. So yes, back to Scott Pilgrim. What did you think of this series? Now we've both seen the movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I've only seen the movie once. I might be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure only once. Is this like one of the movies you see a lot? Because I know you really like Edgar Wright.
No, I haven't seen it like a lot of time. I've seen it more than most people, I would say. I've probably seen it like 5 or 6 times, but it's not my favorite Edgar Wright movie.
Mm-hmm.
But it is an Edgar Wright film, so it is like a special thing to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about the movie when we get there, but this, I'd never experienced this before. I do know that there's a video game that was like massive that came out, and I think I played a little bit of that. I saw
there was a Scott Pilgrim video game adaptation that came out around the time of the movie. I never played it. And I was thinking how I would actually be really curious to try it. Maybe we could talk about it on a bonus episode or something, because I love video games, so I'd be
super into it. I remember when that came out, and I did play a little bit of it. I think a friend had it or something, but it became this like exclusive thing because you couldn't get it anywhere. It became like very.
I wonder, is it available now? Like,
it just was like re-released during quarantine
on like Steam or something.
There was this big push. I think it was Steam or something like that,
or
I don't know, PlayStation Network, Xbox, something.
Wow.
But basically, there was this big push for a long, long time. It was like this cult game that was really scarce. You couldn't get it unless you like pirated it. And then it was a big thing, and then Edgar Wright helped push it. He was like, let's get this game back into relevancy and let people play it because everybody wants to. So I know that's like another offshoot of all of this Scott Pilgrim stuff.
Yeah. Real quick, we're going to do just like a little bit of general thoughts, and then we'll get into specifics about Bryan Lee O Malley, who he is, and then move in through issue by issue. But just in general, what was it like reading for you?
This is such an interesting snapshot of a period of time in the 2000s where, and it is very centering a white male nerd in like a wish fulfillment role. And I know that it is taking, it's poking fun at it in some ways, and it's kind of leaning into the tropes in other ways, and it's trying to be like the specific 2000s sort of slacker version of like some of these like Legend of Zelda like video games and things that it's referencing. It's very clear.
Well, also he specifically said manga, and I think I was there's like a lot of anime where there's like one guy and he like lives in a house with like 6 different women, right? Like those kind of animes.
Like harem anime.
Harem animes. Yeah. I feel like this was kind of playing with that too a little bit, even though I know it was more of a shonen inspired story, but it felt of a kind with that. Definitely.
I mean, and like again, that harem anime is just wish fulfillment for males usually. So it's
he brought that, and he blended it, and he talked about this, like he blended it with American styles, he blended it with European styles, and he made this very unique thing that was still fairly fresh to American audiences and Canadian audiences. He's a Canadian, so I should say that.
Yeah, and I do think that I think other people have done it now, right? Like, I think it's been something that, I think that there are a couple things you can point to. I think of, like, Last Starfighter, or, like, some of these, like, you get a nerd in a scenario where a kind of, like, Ender's Game, if you read Ender's Game, where it's, like... Ready Player One, yeah. Some of these stories where it's like centering this like nerd that in most stories or in most like folklore or everything, that person ends up the hero, and like it's like centering how like their nerdom becomes sort of some of their success, and that's like the ultimate. If you're reading a comic book in the 2000s and you see that, you're like, there's a lot of relatable things going on.
Yeah.
And I did feel like there was something else too, like. There's a little nostalgia there for me when I read this story. Like I notice obviously the problematic elements within the story.
Sure.
But there's something about that time period, and you know, for better or for worse, it kind of reminds me of the 2000s in almost every way, to where like I get nostalgic for a time where I was a white man in America who was privileged and, you know, like was struggling with relationships, and I sucked at them and all that kind of stuff. So like I can understand if that's not your experience, if you don't really engage with it in that way, but being kind of the thing that this is targeting, I responded well to it.
I think you're touching on a lot of the same points I want to make. I definitely I could sense that I was being pandered to. Right. I was like, this book is written for me. Like, it's written for, I mean, Bryan Lee O Malley, I was looking it up. He was born in 1979, so he's 6 years older than me. Mm-hmm. And he seems like he was kind of writing about a time in his life that he had just gotten through, and it was like looking back at it. So honestly, like, as he's releasing these books, 2004 to 2010, like that's like me being 18 to 24, you know what I mean? Like, that's prime age of the characters in this comic.
Right.
And it spoke to so much about my life at that time. It's a very transitory period. I think when you're first coming out of high school, starting college, maybe you dated someone in high school, and then maybe now you're dating someone new, and the messiness and the overlap in those two lives. And for me, that was very much tied to going to college. I know these characters are not college students, but just comparing it to my own life, I saw a lot of similarities there. I for example, when I was 19, my first summer, after attending a year of college, I moved back home for the summer, and I was in a band, and we played house parties, and I used to drink Jägermeister between songs and shit like that. Like, I was very much, it wasn't this scene, like this scene is too cool for like Central Florida. This is too indie. Mine was much more like grungy, like metal stuff. But still, it was kind of that like outcast of society, like just hormones everywhere. It's really messy. Everybody's kind of dated each other in these groups. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of exes around, and you get jealousy going, and it's very like immature in a way. Like, no one really knows how to like behave like an adult, because you're not really any, at that point, even though you might legally be. I don't know. So like, the nostalgia for that time in my life was like hitting me in waves as I'm reading it, and I was realizing like, this is all deliberate, right? Like, this is written for me, like and because it's a self-insert story for Bryan Lee O Malley, I think, obviously, right? And he's even talked about how he was writing about things that happened to him in real life. He was like making them grander and dramatizing them, but it's basically him. He is Scott Pilgrim in these comics. And because of that, I must have lived a similar enough experience to where I was able to easily look at myself. However, Scott Pilgrim's personality varies dramatically from mine. Right. And the way he treats people, I like to think, varies dramatically from the way I did. So there were definitely things I was like chafing against. And then, definitely looking back at it now, there's a lot that didn't age very well. And seems like this was kind of borderline not okay in this era, but it's definitely not okay now. It's obviously depending on who you ask and what you know. Yeah,
it definitely, like, specifically the dialogue in some ways, and like the things that were being said felt real to the time period, but it was like edgy at the time, and like it's clearly not okay. It wasn't okay then. It's not okay. Clearly not okay now. But
And so if you're like a new reader coming into this, and you're a completely different age at the time, or you're a woman, or like, there's a lot of reasons why it might not hit for you at all. That's not to say that there are not a lot of people who love this series who aren't in our demo, because I know there are. This is
Yeah.
a massive series. It's incredibly popular. And whenever something's this popular, it's going to have a wide readership who appreciate it.
I think the built-in people that you're talking about that had similar experiences are the people who are going to be like respond. I don't know. I don't want to speak for everybody because, like you said, there are a ton of people who love this story, but I mean, like, even for the time period, like, it's the approach to just alternative lifestyle, what people would consider alternative lifestyles in general, like slackers living it back at home in some ways, and then like people whose sexuality like run the gamut, like all of these all of this stuff.
Yeah, which at the time I think was it was more edgy, right?
Yeah, I think at the time, I think like this is somewhat progressive.
Yeah. But
But you look at it now, and it's clearly like some of the things were being looked at from like a straight white. I don't know if he's white, but a straight.
oh, for sure.
person.
Every time he refers to like his roommate Wallace being gay, like it's his gay roommate Wallace. Like it has to be said every time, and I was like, really? Do we have to continue to point out? It's like such an essential part of who that character is. It has to be mentioned every time he appears.
And he's like his cool gay roommate, and it's like ownership or something. Like, this is my cool gay best friend or whatever. Like
Yeah.
it feels weird, and I don't know. It feels like it's not.
And a lot of these problems, I don't know if this is experience for you, but for me, a lot of these problems were worse at the beginning in the early issues, and then got better. Didn't go away, but got better as it went along. Part of that is also the fleshing out of all the side characters, which for me was the main thing that kept me engaged, was learning more about all the side characters, because ultimately I found basically all of them more interesting than Scott.
Right. Because at the end of the day, he is just supposed to be a blank page. He's like the Harry Potter of this story. He's like,
yeah, I guess so.
like his personality can't be he can't be that interesting, because it'll like sort of, he's supposed to be the person that everybody can see themselves in. So if he's a very specific type of person, then I think it makes it not as broadly sort of attachable.
Yeah.
But
well,
you know,
and we were talking about other people who like this, who maybe don't fit in that demo. I think that's the side characters, right? Like, I think the more you read it, I think a lot of people see themselves, or just really like these characters. The art style is very endearing. I thought it was like this really interesting blend. It feels kind of like anime, but it's also very cartoony and very cute. But not cutesy, but like the characters are just like approachable. And even though there's definitely lots of like sexuality and stuff drawn with very kind of male gaze, it's not like overly sexualized like some manga are. It was in that sense not too overdone. And because of that, like, I took a look on Instagram, and like there's tons of fan art still being made to this day, like fresh stuff getting drawn all the time, people like reimagining these characters and just seem to be fascinated with them. And I think a lot of that also comes back to how well he was able to capture the style, the speech, the mannerisms of people in this scene and at this time. And a lot of people identify with that, and I think gravitate towards these characters. The girl who changes her hair color every 2 weeks. Like, a lot of people knew people like this or dated people like this.
Like you were talking about how like this wasn't necessarily your scene, and this sort of story was coming about at like a very formative time for me. And I'm not saying that this exactly is how like my group of friends and everybody was, but it did feel like the roots of my adolescence is in this story, because there's something about the way that like people don't take themselves too seriously, but also like everything's the end of the world. I don't know, it just feels very much like oh, I can see my personality being shaped by this time period.
Yeah.
And I don't know, stories like this, probably like things like this that just latched onto the zeitgeist and music of the time and all that other stuff. Like I think in that time period, like, skateboarding and like everybody wanted to be in a band. I played drums a little bit. I was super fucking awful at it, and we didn't have a real band or anything like that, but it was all like sort of that time period.
Yeah. Also, it struck me as just how often they go to each other's houses and like hang out on each other's beds. And I was thinking how true to life that is. Like, when I was that age, I spent so much time in people's bedrooms, just like sitting on their bed. And just how like intimate that is. I don't know. It's such something you don't really do as an adult anymore. Now you tend to not go in people's bedrooms.
Imagine making a friend, and then at this age, and then eventually being like, let's go hang out in your bedroom, and like how interesting and weird that would feel. And especially loaded, like people who are like in relationships, which all these characters are,
of course,
constantly.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But before we go, I mean, I have so much more to say, but I want to save some for when we actually talk about specific issues, because there's a really interesting arc this took, and I felt like I went on a journey with it and the way I felt about the series. Before I do that, let's talk a little bit about Bryan Lee O Malley. He is half Korean, half French Canadian. Like I said earlier, born in 1979, went to school in Ontario, and was a film studies major who ended up dropping out of the University of Western Ontario, so did not graduate. He said that the series he was inspired to create the eponymous character of Scott Pilgrim after listening to a Canadian band called Plumtree, and they had a 1998 single called Scott Pilgrim, a song that then Plumtree singer Carla Gillis describes as, quote, positive but also bittersweet. In particular, Malley was inspired by the lyric, quote, I've liked you for 1,000 years. So 1998, he got this idea for this character, Scott Pilgrim. The first issue of the comic would come out in 2004, which was black and white. The entire run was black and white. It only got colorized later. We read the colorized versions.
I actually only read two of my volumes were of color, and then I received the physical copies, which were black and white.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, because I had the digital for all 6, and mine were all color. Interesting. Okay, so
I read 2 of them. I read 2 of them digitally on like Kindle, and then got the physical copies in the mail.
I watched a little bit of a stream where he was talking about the black and white versus the colorized versions, and he actually sometimes would reimagine. Like he was showing how he had to like reimagine certain scenes for the color version and stuff.
I do know. Yeah. I do know, like, being someone who reads a lot of manga, like black and white being a very specific art style in comics, right?
And he did that on purpose, but also because it was cheaper. He basically said, like, it was a manga thing, but also it was cheaper, so those two things came together.
So the use of blacks in manga, like the use of like black, like there are even panels that I don't know what they would have looked like in color, but like whenever they go into like this like subspace area and it's like entirely black, when you get an entire page of black in a comic, you're like, oh shit, like this is very intentional, and it's also costed a shitload of money to put black ink, have an entire page of black ink.
Yeah.
So like it was it's a big choice to do something like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, the use of I know that like specifically Japanese manga artists are like very into the like being able to adequately use black and be artistic. I don't know. There's something about the way that like it's so stark, right? There's like white and the black, and like the contrast between the two, and the way that the black can dominate the page or the white can dominate the page, and I don't know. There's all kinds of stuff you can look into about it.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that was all things he was playing with, because he was influenced heavily by a lot of manga, which we can talk about some of them. I do think it's interesting to note that all these colorized versions came out after the film, right? Like that's like the power of a film, right? Like it creates so much interest. The run itself, like I don't have the exact numbers, but I know he was saying like the first volume and even the second volume, incredibly small distribution. He only expected about 1,000 copies to sell. And it wasn't until later where it started really taking off. And then of course for the adaptation, it just kind of it skyrocketed. But even at that point, it was popular. So he said that he wanted to write a shonen style comic book series. And he had only read one such series at the time, Ranma 1/2. And apparently that was like a main inspiration. He also gained inspiration from a book called Even a Monkey Can Draw Manga by Koji Ihara. In 2002, his roommate, who worked in a comic book store, brought him the book while he was working on the Lost at Sea, which was his first graphic novel, and he was planning Scott Pilgrim. Upon reading it, he realized that despite the satirical tone, it could be an effective guide to how the Japanese comic book industry worked. He has noted that a lot of people point to Was it Fooly Cooly? Is that how you say it?
Fooly Cooly is one of my favorite anime and manga ever.
Yeah, a lot of people point to that as like they assume that was like a huge influence, and he said that while it was an influence, that it was not nearly as direct as a lot of people seem to think it was.
That's one of the most revolution, like that Fooly Cooly is easily one of the most influential things to happen to manga and anime, potentially ever. And it's only like 6 episodes or something. So if you want to watch that, if people are listening, I highly recommend it. It's very, very oddball. It's very like, it might be a little tough to latch onto, but I promise you the visuals are worth it. And sort of the same kind of vibe that we're talking about with Scott Pilgrim being like awkward and like abnormal is in that Fooly Cooly series as well.
Yeah, and it's one that I've always wanted to watch, but I've just never gotten around to it. Oh, the anime, and obviously read the manga. I didn't do any of that, because manga, in addition to comics, another thing I'm just not very exposed to.
I've got the Blu-ray if you want it.
So yeah, it was published by published by Oni Press, which apparently is a Portland-based publisher, which is really cool. It sounded familiar, but I wasn't sure. So that's always fun. I live in Portland, Oregon, so it's neat to think about how this was all going on. Now, it was before I got here, but to think that this was all going around in this area is exciting. Yeah, he had an actual gay roommate who he based Wallace on. A lot of the characters in this series are based on real people. He would take like at least certain pieces of their personality and like directly. He even used like the names of like 2 girls he knew in high school, and he like, I think they're the 2 girls that show up randomly in like bars and stuff and like comment on stuff. Like he just used their exact names.
That's funny.
Yeah, so it really is very strongly about like his life in a way, and he's talked about how he really values and puts a lot of emphasis in writing relationships and how that's what really fascinates him. And that's the other thing that I found interesting about this comic is that it is also kind of just like a male romance. Like it's about a guy's like romantic exploits. Now it's set up to be kind of like a shonen action video gamey exciting combat thing, but ultimately this is a romance story, right? Like it's about finding the love of your life and having to fight for her, and so it's interesting that it feels like it does everything it can to not be that, but like at its heart that's what it is.
It's not as romantic as that makes it sound. Like it's almost more like possessive.
Sure, yeah, more possessive. And it's very like I don't know, like it's messy. That's all this stuff is very messy. Scott is like, he's got the worst wandering eye. Like he's attracted to everybody. He seems to forget all the time that he's like dating someone. I mean, right from the jump, which we'll get into in issue 1. Colorized by Nathan Fairbairn. So I just wanted to give him a shout out because I think he did a great job, honestly. Like, and seeing that stream where O'Malley was comparing the two, like the colors are striking. They really just invigorated everything in a way, and I enjoy it. Now I recognize that maybe the classic way to view it maybe isn't that black and white, but I really enjoy having the color. Just someone who's new to this stuff.
I read both, and I liked the color for the ones that I did read the first 2 volumes. And part of me felt like as I started to read the black and white. Luckily, I did literally finish reading. Like I was getting caught up on one of these mangas that I read. I hadn't read in a few like weeks. And basically, I went from that like straight into reading Scott Pilgrim. So there wasn't like when I received the actual physical copies that were in black and white. So there wasn't like a disconnect. And I kind of but when I first was reading it in color, I was kind of like, damn, I hope that like I'm not like less interested. And honestly, I didn't think after like a few pages in, I didn't think anything of it. I didn't even miss it.
There was one joke, I can't remember which issue it was in, but it was when Ramona changes her hair. Yeah. Did you get that joke in the black and white version? Or
yeah, it literally was in black and white.
Yeah, because it's like everyone's reacting. They're like, "Wow, that's a really surprising color."
It's just a different shade of black.
Yeah, and then like in the color version, there's a little note that says this was funnier in the black and white edition.
Oh, that's
which I thought was really funny.
I like that a lot. That's cool.
Because they had to pick a color, obviously for this version, which I thought was funny. Anyway, let me read the quick summary for Volume 1. Scott Pilgrim, a 23-year-old slacker, lives in Toronto with his roommate Wallace Wells. He is the bass player for Sex Babam, an unsuccessful band consisting of himself, guitarist Stephen Stills, and drummer Kim Pine. To the discomfort of Scott's friends, he has recently begun dating Knives Chow, a 17-year-old school student. After having a dream about a woman on rollerblades, Scott encounters her in real life and discovers that she is Ramona Flowers, who can travel through subspace and who has recently moved to Toronto after breaking up with a man named Gideon Graves. After Scott attempts to meet Ramona again, he receives an ominous email from someone named Matthew Patel. As Sex Bomb prepares for a concert, Matthew appears and reveals himself as the first of Ramona's evil exes. He and Scott fight a video game-style battle from which Scott emerges victorious. Ramona informs Scott that if they are to date, he must first defeat her 6 other evil exes. Okay, so that's the setup for this whole series. I want to ask you, before we really get into it, do you have a favorite character?
Let me think about it. Do you have one that you want to say?
Yeah, I have 2, but I will just give you my top choice. My top choice, it changed throughout, but it ended up by the end, it was Kim Pine, the drummer. I loved her, and I wanted a little bit more. I wanted some different stuff which we could talk about from her story, but I just thought she was so cool, and I don't know, just throughout the amount that she like calls Scott on his shit always made me happy. Like her, you know, her certain characters are able to do that in this story, and she is definitely one of them.
What percentage of you felt like, I mean, I guess you've seen the movie, but what percentage did you feel like they might end up together ultimately? Like, how much did you feel like Kim and Scott should have ended up together ultimately?
0. I did not want Scott to end up with Kim, and in fact, she's too good for him, which I think might even be said at one point. No, there are other characters I was kind of hoping Kim was going to end up with, which she doesn't really end up with anybody, which is fine. But we can talk about that. But
I like Kim. Ooh, it's tough to pick on the spot. I feel like I still need to think harder on it, but I did really like. I like Ramona a lot.
Yeah,
you know. Yeah, I like. You know, I think part of that is that we get a lot of her.
Ramona, in a way, is very frustrating to me, though, in the same way that Scott is. But it's built into the character. Like both of them, and I think we understand that less about Ramona early, have a lot of like figuring themselves out to do. And she definitely goes through that in the later issues, like figuring out what she actually wants and, you know, coming to grips with the fact that she tends to be the one who leaves and stuff like that. And there's a certain sort of flightiness to that character that I found kind of triggering in a way, not to make light of it. But like, honestly, it reminds me of certain people that I had unsuccessful relationships with that had similar issues. And these kind of people are very frustrating, and Scott is definitely one of those kinds of people. So while I liked Ramona, I also found her a little bit more frustrating, I guess.
I understand that, yeah. And ultimately, I think that's part of what makes these characters endearing is that like they are imperfect. You know, like they are like so.
They all got tons of baggage, right?
You can't really contain them into like a nice neat box that you would like to. And there, we're gonna have to talk about like the sort of manic pixie dream girl thing that
literally a manic pixie dream girl, like one of the most prime examples I think you could draw. If I ever talk about that trope again, I am going to mention her. She literally shows up in his dreams on roller skates. She's the definition of that like manic pixie, you know, personality type, and
she also like represents the goal for a protagonist too. Like this is like what the ultimate goal of the entire story for him is to just like have her.
She's everything that he would want, in every way. Yeah. Absolutely. So should I give you my second favorite or should I hold that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. My second favorite is actually Wallace.
I do like Wallace.
And at first I didn't think it was going to be because I was frustrated with how frequently it felt like his sexuality was a joke, and it kept coming up over and over again. So the first, like, I think 2 or 3 volumes, I was kind of more frustrated with the character, but it did feel like they eased off a little bit on the jokiness of it later. And I think some of the funniest shit Wallace does is later. He has some of the best lines. And again, you notice a pattern with these two characters. Both characters who call Scott on his shit frequently, and so because of that, I love them.
Well, yeah, and he really represents the voice of reason a lot of the time.
Sometimes,
where it's like, you have those friends. You have those friends that are like, things have happened, move on. Life isn't over. Like, continue. And Wallace represents that a lot for Scott.
Yeah.
And Scott never takes his advice.
So
he continues.
Oh, I mean, absolutely.
I do have a funny anecdote that happened to me, and Amazon.ca is a large portion of this story. It's very important because Ramona works for Amazon. And this is early Amazon. This is 2004 Amazon.
Yeah, this is book delivery.
Amazon. So Amazon is, Ramona skates up. And
she's the one Amazon delivery driver and skater and whatever in like all of Toronto.
Yep. And so she delivers the package and he's like waiting by the door and everything. And, of course I remember the scene from the movie. I told you I was reading the Kindle versions on my tablet, and I'm like going through and reading. And while I'm reading that scene, my doorbell rings. Mm-hmm. And who is it?
It's Ramona Flowers.
It's Amazon. Oh. It's Amazon delivering these books to me.
Was it Ramona?
It wasn't Ramona.
Okay.
No. It was actually like my typical Amazon delivery man.
Oh, okay. He, wasn't it like a pink-haired Manic Pixie Dream Girl out there?
No, not this time.
Okay.
But yeah, I thought that was such good like synergy for their company there. Like they must have known that I was on that scene because I was on my tablet.
The chances that would end up being what it is today.
And it's also like it made me think a lot about like that Amazon versus modern Amazon and like what Amazon represents. And I don't necessarily condone buying books from Amazon every time. Like I think that you can, there are other places to support books and things like that, but this time I ordered from Amazon and they happened to deliver as I was reading about it.
I condone it. I just don't. I just recommend varying it up every now and then. But I mean, buying books is buying books. That's good no matter what. Okay, so let's talk about issue 1 though, because this issue was rough. This was the one I struggled with the most, the one where I was like, oh, I'm in for a long series. I really didn't like Scott in this. He's introduced as dating this Knives Chow character. He treats her like shit the whole time, immediately cheats on her with Ramona, and then doesn't break up with her because he's like a coward. And everything he does, honestly, just makes me dislike him viscerally. I mean, like, he's this, like, lovable loser the whole time, but, like, that wasn't enough for me to like the character, at least in this issue. It was still fun, but I was like, okay, this just isn't going to be for me. And I definitely, it was kind of the low point in my journey with this series.
Yeah. Like almost his slacker, all the things that he represents is almost too real. Like it is very like, he's not likable, like you said, in all of the ways that like that lifestyle can be really, it can be tough for people around them. Yeah. It can be tough for just you in general and like your continued mental health, and like the way that he's like, he's reaching out for anybody he can get a hold of, and he reaches out for Knives Chow and she doesn't deserve it. And like, yeah, it sucks. Yeah.
And I felt so bad for Knives throughout, but, he really represents a phenomenon that is super common in, guys this age like us. And I think everybody has a piece of this when you're this age, because you're still like maturing, emotionally. But a lot of guys I knew, and again, like I think all of us are affected by it in some way. It's like you fail to see other people's humanity, and you're focused more on like how they intersect with your life and what they mean to you. So he views all these women not as like people, but as like hot chicks, like dream girls, whatever it might be. And it's I don't know, it's kind of gross, I guess, but it's also part of his journey. Like, and I understand that it seems to be done deliberately, or at least it looks like it was deliberate by the time we get to the end, because that is what his journey is about, I think, right? Ultimately. But here it's tough to see because it feels like he's incredibly selfish. He's a jerk to everybody. He really only cares about who he finds hot, and that seems to be the only thing that matters to him.
He's a burden to everybody around him.
Yeah.
And again, I identify with that at certain points in my life. You know what I mean? Like I've been that
exactly.
person.
I feel like everybody like it's very understandable when you're a certain age you're like you're still maturing emotionally. Like you only really care about yourself and your like how people affect you, and you know what I mean. Like you're not really putting yourself in other people's shoes. Like that's a skill that you have to develop over time. I certainly did. And I feel like it is accurate for a lot of people, in this age bracket.
Yeah. And I cringe at thinking about like what I used to be.
Yeah,
like,
and that's
sure.
why dating was so like, I mean, one of the many reasons why it was so fraught, right? Like, because you have all these people who are emotionally immature, trying to do this thing, trying to date each other, and being selfish and not thinking about other people's feelings, and considering them like actual other human beings. Which, like, obviously I'm exaggerating it, but you know what I'm trying to say.
I think people who are emotionally mature enough to like sort of be what we're talking about right now, who were like aware of other people and were nice and all this stuff, were the anomaly.
Yeah.
Like they weren't the norm.
Yeah.
They were the people, and like they were the people that you looked to and you were like, I wish I could be like that, but I'm too selfish.
Well, and also it's a spectrum. Like, where are you at in that? How much do you actually, put yourself in other people's shoes? It's always a spectrum. Oh, the other thing we should talk about is the fact that this is all set up to be this like larger than life epic battle. And how that works in like a meta narrative, how there's like all these video game things going on. He's getting one up, he gets one up in a later comic. He's getting weapons, he's getting experience points and all this kind of shit, coins.
Proficiencies are talked about. Yeah.
Wait, what was your take on all that?
I mean, I liked it. And I think that this is some of the stuff that I was talking about when this movie came out, and I don't know if it's because this movie was a response to the comic, and the comic took 6 years to come out. And I think the movie came out like as the last issues were coming out. I forget how it worked out, but I think like Edgar had to be told how the comic run would end. And I think, I don't know, we'll look more into that for the next episode, but it got there. I just remember people being like, it's trying too hard to be something. It's trying to say like we said, it's almost like extreme pandering. Mm-hmm. But I think that there are plenty of things in here. There are more surface level things for people who aren't necessarily like that steeped in a lot of this stuff. And then there are like very subtle things that are just in the background, or just a logo, or just like I don't know. I saw like a bunch of like his t-shirts were very clearly almost every single time there were a reference. I saw a little slime from Dragon Quest. I saw obviously the Upside Down Triforce was one. There are so many throughout. And I liked a lot of it. Like I think, and when we get to the movie, we'll talk more about the movie on its own. But in this case, I do feel like some of the stuff was like out and out said, like, oh, I learned how to play the bass line from Final Fantasy II. Mm-hmm. Like, that's like, even if you haven't heard it, you understand the reference in a way because it's said to you.
Yeah.
So
a lot of establishing nerd cred, like that kind of stuff going on.
That's kind of what it feels like. And I can understand people.
That's why I did think of Ready Player One a little bit with that. Wade Watts does some similar things. But what the grand nature of it, and then making it kind of into an epic, one of the reasons why I feel like it works so well for this story is because that's what everything feels like when you're this age, and you're just starting to date people, and you're like trying to figure out who you're going to be with. And like, I mean, I know dating always feels monumental in people's lives, because it is, but like there's a certain special power it has at this time frame in your life.
Yeah.
And it does feel like
the end of the world.
The end of the world when someone cheats on you, when something goes wrong. It feels like the love of your life, who you just lost, and you're never going to find love again. Everything's so dramatic. You don't have the experience to like look back and go like, oh, that's not the end of the world. It'll be okay. Like, you don't have that experience. So everything feels so fresh and so like powerful. And it feels like you're doing battle on like epic scales and all this stuff, So it works in that sense too.
You also don't have that much going on too. Like, you're at a period where like you're transitioning to maybe a professional life, and you don't have that to lean on to be like, this is the thing that I'm proud of. So like the relationships have so much weight. And like you said, when something goes wrong, or the other end of it, if like you start dating somebody, it feels so much more elated. I mean, I feel like that's pretty realistic for the time period for sure.
All right, let's move into issue number 2. So Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which ends up being the title of the film, is volume 2. Did I say the volume 1 was called Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life? I think I forgot to say that. So Scott Pilgrim versus the World, volume 2. In a flashback 7 years prior, a high school aged Scott forms a band with Kim and his friend Lisa Miller. and later rescues Kim when she is kidnapped by students from a rival school. In the present, Scott confronts Ramona's second evil ex, Lucas Lee, an actor and professional skateboarder shooting a movie in Toronto, who informs Scott about the, quote, League of Evil Exes. Scott is able to defeat Lucas by goading him into skateboarding and subsequently crashing on the Baldwin steps. Scott breaks up with Knives after Wallace threatens to tell Ramona about her, though Knives later learns about Ramona and attacks her. Later, Scott receives a call from his ex-girlfriend Envy Adams, who asks him to open for her band, The Clash at Demon Head. At the band's concert, Ramona identifies Clash at Demon Head's bassist as her ex-boyfriend, Todd Ingram. Okay, issue number 2. What'd you think?
Yeah, one of the things I want to address is this idea that, like, no one questions the fact that Scott can just beat the shit out of anybody, like, when it comes down to it. And it is, like, this exaggerated version of, like,
he's the hero.
The shonen protagonist.
Exactly.
But, like, specifically the shonen protagonist where, like, he's Goku. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, he's going to get it done. He's Naruto. He's the main character that, like, we don't question and no one even in the world questions. And like, you know, he'll get beat up and stuff, but eventually he'll win the fight. It's just funny too, because you look at the size of him in most panels in comparison to some of the people that he's fighting, and like, it doesn't matter. He just has this innate ability to like fight people, which is like very video gamey. But yeah, the League of Evil Exes it's the bosses, right? So it's very much the tiered level system, and it kind of makes it neat and easy for the writer, right? Like, it's like, this is my format here, and then I'm gonna stick to this, and then like do things within this framework. And honestly, like, there's something fun about reading it that feels like playing a video game too, because like you're going along with the journey like you would with a video game.
You know, it has an end point. You're like, well, we're gonna read about the 7 X's. That's the end point of this comic.
We know there's 7 of them. We've beat 4 of them. You know, we're four
and
out
even
of 7.
the back cover of, on my versions at least, what like showed you where you were at along the progression, and it had like question marks for the future ones and stuff. Like, yeah, it was very gamified in that way. So this is I literally have a note where I go, people really think Scott Pilgrim is scum, and he is. And then I said, is he the villain of this story? And I don't think he is. Like, he is and he isn't, right? Like, at the same time that he is, like we're talking about, he's the hero. He can kind of do no wrong. But in many ways, he's also the villain. Like, he is the source of so much of the conflict.
And Bryan O'Malley agrees with you. He has the Nega Scott or whatever at the end where he fights himself.
Yeah, Nega Scott, which I was laughing when I saw that happen later. Yeah.
Yeah, because he's creating so much of his own problems.
I loved that in this issue he gets a mithril skateboard after he defeats Lucas Lee, but then he can't use it because he didn't take a proficiency in it, so it just winks out of existence. I don't know. I love it. There's all these little jokes that just work so well. What about Knives? Because we see her go like she gets the highlights in her hair and she gets all upset and she's all like vengeful now, and
she goes like assassin mode too.
Yeah, which like the way her character progresses, I do like, but like early on, I still just felt like she was just, I don't know. I felt so bad for her, and then I also felt like her obsession with Scott just feeds into that power fantasy thing. Like, every woman is just so obsessed with him. Like, it just makes you feel good if you're Scott, right?
Something we didn't talk about that this doesn't necessarily handle super, super well. And it's interesting because I didn't realize, I kind of thought that Bryan O'Malley was like a white guy, but you said that he's like half Korean. Yeah. But the way that this story handles race, I was surprised with as well. Like, there are like moments of race played for laughs, and like there's a lot of like emphasis on like, he's like, at one point he's like, oh, you know, he's like, he just like Scott keeps saying like, you Japanese so and so's, and like very specifically talking about like the race was very important. And I wonder, like, is it time period that like this is how people talk about things? Is it?
I'm sure that was the defense of it. I mean, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely there. I think a lot of the stuff that goes on with Knives it feels kind of tinged in
her dad
especially,
very specifically.
There's a specific line where he says, "I thought you weren't allowed to date outside your race," which made me cringe. I don't know. It's a little bit uncomfortable. And again, I'm sure he was doing it because it was the way people talked, and you know, he's trying to be true to life, I think. But then part of it is like trying to make jokes, and some of those jokes just don't land for me. What about Envy Adams? I mean, this is our first introduction to her. She's a big character going forward. She's very dramatically drawn. I think she's kind of the most angular sort of depiction of anybody. She is introduced in a very intense way. They're having this like stare down, her and Ramona. I did find it funny how I loved that scene where they were in the backstage area and Knives is like fanning out like crazy while her and Scott are having this like showdown, and Ramona, and like, so there's all this other drama going on, but then Knives is trying to be like this super fan, and just the way those things all interacted with each other, I thought was really clever.
Yeah. And again, the expressionism and the expressions of the characters within this sort of cartoon manga, like the style of it all, it's almost like chibi a little bit. Are you familiar with like chibi?
No.
Art? It's like, so like in an anime, if there are like legitimate chibi animes, but it's like bigger head, small body, and sometimes there'll be a scene.
Oh, so like when they reference it or something, they'll do a little like cute version of the characters.
Sometimes there'll be like a normal scene going on, and then they'll like jump into like a little argument, and it'll be like smaller versions of themselves with large heads, and they're kind of like cutesier, and almost like at certain times the style of this felt like
I didn't
that
know
as
that's
well.
what it was called. That's cool. Yeah, I am familiar with it now that you mention it. I can see that. Okay, so Scott Pilgrim and the Infinite Sadness is volume 3. Scott attempts to fight Todd, but is powerless against his psychic vegan powers. Through a flashback, Envy's background as a quiet, mousy girl who developed a callous and aggressive personality as her music career ascended is revealed. Envy attempts to organize a competition between Scott and Todd at Honest Ed's, but Todd's psychic powers destroy the store. When Envy discovers that Todd has been cheating on her with the band's drummer, he attacks her. Scott and Todd battle again, which is won by Scott after the vegan police arrive and strip Todd of his psychic powers for having violated his vegan diet by eating gelato and chicken parmesan. Scott earns an extra life, and Envy leaves Toronto to pursue a solo career.
Yeah, I actually do think all the work that's done with Envy's backstory, like I like Envy as a character because of the arcs that we go through with that character, especially getting the flashbacks. And a lot of the flashbacks in this are not, you don't get that in the film. And I thought a lot of that stuff was keeping me engaged a lot to this story. And we got the flashback with Kim and the forming of the band in one of the issues and one of the volumes, and then we got
so much more
Envy
with
stuff.
Kim than I remember from the movie. I mean, and I don't want to talk too much about the movie, but that is one of the joys I had reading this, was spending so much more time with these characters, like seeing their day-to-day lives, getting to know their backstories and how they all intersected, and seeing like little scenes between them that often didn't make it into the movie, at least in my memory of it. So yeah, there is a lot here for like people who've seen the movie and might be curious about the comics. There's a lot here for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of it is represented in the film, but yeah, there's a certain run times of the film that you just can't spend quite as much time. But I can't wait to talk about that. And I can't wait to notice new things that only a comic reader going into the film will have noticed, because I've never had that experience of the Edgar Wright film.
Right.
So the veganism stuff I wanted to talk to you about, like how do vegans feel about this portrayal?
Yeah, so I'm not a vegan, although I know several, and I have been eating a lot less meat. I don't eat red meat very much at all anymore. And I'm sure that this rubs vegans the wrong way. This does feel very of a time, because I remember in this time period, vegans were, it was like, there was such a strong stereotype of the like snooty, better than you, holier than thou vegan who rubs it in your face. And I don't even know how like true to life that is, but that was the stereotype, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's playing with that. And
I think a lot of it was like guilt. People who felt a little guilty, and they were just like pushing it off to the it's their fault because they're.
And I'm sure there are some very annoying holier than thou vegans out there. Like, I have no doubt that is a thing that people experienced. But
I also wonder if for this time period of veganism, just like enjoyed having representation of some kind, and having a superpower isn't the worst thing, and like I know it's a stereotype and all of that,
it's silly
but I
when the
wonder,
vegan police show up and all that.
Right.
I don't know, I think it was like I don't know, it was around the time I first heard the term vegan. I don't know exactly how long, like how far back that term goes, but it wasn't something I heard about. I heard vegetarian growing up, right, but not vegan until around this time frame.
Yeah. The psychic powers were extremely powerful as well,
Yeah.
like blowing holes in the moon and stuff, and like yeah. This was a character that, like, without the vegan police, Scott was not defeating.
Yeah, and they even say something about it being a Deus Ex Machina when it happens. I did think some of that was like kind of weak, is by comparison, but funny, so it's okay. Like, you can get away with stuff like that in a comic like this. But some of the rest of this was okay. I did really like all the Envy backstory. The fact that Todd is cheating on her makes him like more despicable in our eyes. It makes us feel sorry for her, and it is also another situation where we see Ramona being a little bit jealous for the first time, which I thought was like refreshing too. It wasn't all about Scott. It was also about Ramona and how she deals with Scott's exes, of which there are many. Maybe just as many as she has. It seems like very close to. And I do like, again, like, this represents a very true to life thing, right? Especially when you date people who have been a part of the same social circles for a long time. You'll start dating someone, and you'll find out that, like, that's their ex, and they dated for a little while, and they once kissed, but they didn't ever date, and like, there's all these people who are still around and still hanging out, and like, if you're gonna date that person, you have to like reckon with that, and you're maybe you feel jealousy, but you're trying to play it off, and like, you're worried that, like, what if there's still flames there and I just don't know it, and maybe there are, so it's messy.
And at that time period in your life too, like I said, everything feels so much larger, and so like the jealousy is real. Like, I think as you mature, you realize like some of the stuff doesn't matter. Like, people have pasts, everybody's everybody has all this, but before that, people don't really have a past. These are early exploits into
the
their
past that they do have feel monumental, because it's like,
right, it's the only other person they've ever dated or something.
Or it's like, I've only dated one other person, you've dated 4 other people. Oh my God. Like, that's such a dramatic difference when both are incredibly small numbers or whatever. You know what I mean? Insert whatever number. Okay, let's talk about issue 4. So if issue 4 is called Scott Pilgrim Gets It Together. Stephen begins to record an album for Sex Bomb with Kim's roommate Joseph. Scott is attacked by a samurai and a ninja. The latter is revealed to be Roxy Richter, Ramona's 4th evil ex. Scott is kicked out of the apartment by Wallace and gets into a fight with Ramona after she suspects that Scott is attracted to Lisa. He stays at Lisa's apartment, where Roxy infiltrates his dreams and attacks him. Scott awakens without memories of the previous night, though Lisa informs him that he confessed that he loved Ramona. The samurai is revealed to be Knives' father, Mr. Chow, who disliked that his father was dating a white person. When he attacks Scott again, Scott escapes via a subspace portal and ends up in Ramona's mind, where he sees her as a slave to a shadowy figure. Upon exiting, Scott encounters his dark, quote, Nega Scott, and rejects it. He returns to find Ramona being attacked by Mr. Chow. Realizing his cowardice, Scott confesses that he loves Ramona and earns the, quote, power of love, a sword that he uses to defeat Roxy. Mr. Chow leaves, having earned respect for Scott, and Scott moves in with Ramona. This is the one that also opens with the beach party, like the beach scene, which I thought was also a very anime thing, to like, all the characters go to the beach.
Yeah, that's always like a filler thing.
Yeah, but I mean, like, it's, it's fun or whatever, and
right.
The one thing that I do find really cool about comics that is very different than writing is that the person who is creating the story is also drawing it.
Some of the time.
Yeah. I guess just some of the time. Yeah. But like here that was happening. And at the end of these issues, he was showing his, like, all of his sketches, which I found fascinating. And just, certain characters in all these different poses, trying out with different styles. Like, he's very specific with how they dress. And I don't know, there's just something very unlike what you have to do as a writer, where it's all sort of realm of the imagination, when you can sit there and have a page where you're drawing different poses, and like, the character is so concrete in a way that they're not in fiction, where they still in fiction they exist in this like liminal imaginary space, whereas here it's like, no, this is the character, like, I've drawn them.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just found it fascinating.
Yeah, it's tough to think about like chicken or the egg in this situation. Like, do you start drawing first? Do you start writing first? Like, I know there are different artists will approach it differently. So it's like, yeah, I don't know. Like, famously, one that I always talk about is Miyazaki. Like, his films are Oscar award winning and they're like internationally acclaimed. And then, but a lot of his process tends to be like sort of just go through it chronologically and write as you go, which is terrifying. That's a terrifying way to make something a visual medium, like a movie. Like that's terrifying.
So, I mean, you're right on it, but I mean, everybody has their different methods. So, I mean, whatever works. In this issue, a couple things. One, this is where the nostalgia hit me hardest. And I was realizing that because it is summer. And so he was drawing everyone in their like summer fashion. And summer fashion in Toronto apparently has a lot of similarities to Florida wear, because this was like really strongly reminding me of the kind of shit people wear around here, or around where I was from, in Florida. So this was very much like transporting me back to a certain time. And then I also noticed that this is where like, there's a joke about like, have you said the L word yet? And he's like, lesbian? And she's like, no, love. I think Wallace might be the one who asked him about it at first. But it comes up a few times. And then we see Knives and Kim, I think, are like making out when they're drunk. And it feels very like male fantasy in the way that it's dealt with. I was hoping that it was going to lead somewhere. And I was either hoping for Kim, I referenced this earlier, but I was either hoping for Kim to end up with Knives or to end up with Lisa. I thought they also had some chemistry there. And that I was kind of hoping that, because it felt like with the way that it was left, the lesbianism was sort of, again, kind of jokey, or sort of just it was considered hot, but not like a serious thing that like people would actually pursue.
I mean, and to get to something that happens in this is we meet Roxy, right? And like at one point Ramona says like it was just a phase, and like what that does to like someone who is a lesbian,
which,
and
like,
how that's like
people that you may feel that way, but like, that's why I was hoping that it would get some representation later in the story.
Right. I just mean like there's like I think there's like a certain subsection of people who will say like, oh, she's a lesbian, it's just a phase, she'll get through it, she'll get over it or something, or and like that's such a like it's
a terrible thing to say.
It's an awful thing to say. Yeah, it's not like you're trying to tell somebody how they're gonna live their life.
Well, and also like bisexuality is a thing, like, legitimately. Right. So like, this sort of ignores that. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, and to have these characters end up together ultimately would have been like I feel like to come full circle to say like, no, these are normal things that happen in everyday life and everybody's okay.
And
with
because
it.
we're so tied to Scott, it's all about like his like potential of having a threesome becomes what it seems to be about. Right. You know what I mean?
That keeps coming up too. Yeah.
And it all seems in service to that. And that's why I was hoping that it would go somewhere else, where it's like, no, these two are together and they're happy and it has nothing to do with you, Scott. I really wanted that.
Right. Exactly.
And it's like, they decided they don't like you at all, and fuck you. But we don't get that, unfortunately. I don't know. Maybe, let me know if I'm wrong. I'm sure people have lots of other ideas about Kim. I mean, this is also where we see the caricature of Knives' father. This, like, he doesn't really speak English, and he's drawn in a way that almost doesn't fit, doesn't line up with some of the other styles. I don't know. It just, things about this depiction of the father was some of the stuff that bothered me the most when it came to not great representation. Agreed.
Yeah, it was just like hard. It just felt like it didn't fit. Like you said, it didn't feel lighthearted. It kind of felt like he was the butt of the jokes, and like it was made to be like this samurai warrior because he's Asian, and like, all that stuff felt kind of weird. Yeah.
But it didn't ruin the story for me, because this is where I really wrote down that like I was like, I'm starting to warm to this series more. The subspace stuff going into the void was really interesting. I was trying to figure out what was going on there. The glow. There's like certain mysteries. We're getting a lot more with these side characters. I was really hoping that this stuff would happen with Kim, and I started getting invested in my hope that would happen. There was just more for me to sink my teeth into. in the story at this point. And it felt like Scott was like maybe not quite as terrible. You know, we're talking like percentage points, but he's starting to learn a little bit here and there.
Yeah.
And then
well, it's like the moment that he like realizes that he was being a coward and confesses his love, and then like he gets the respect of Mr. Chow, and like all of these things are like making us feel like he's making progress in some way. So Nega Scott also happens in volume 4, and I just wanted to ask you like what you thought, because this sort of character is like, this is like his going to the woods, and this is Luke Skywalker going into the woods and fighting like a vision of Darth Vader, and then he cuts off the head, and then like the mask blows off, and it's actually himself.
Yeah.
And then in like Dark Link, there's like Link tends to fight like a dark version of himself sometimes.
I mean, it's very meta. It's very on the nose. It's very like the worst parts of self, but like it's not really defined yet, too. It's just a hint of it, I think, in issue 4, and it becomes more of a thing. And I really think issue 6 is where it's actually called Nega Scott, for example. But yeah, it works because it's goofy and fantasy, and it's in tone with everything else. And this is really about Scott learning to best his like inner demons and like the worst parts of himself. And so why not have it manifest as a Nega Scott? I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it's always something. I think it people will see it as like a trope, and it definitely is a trope. But it's effective. Like I like.
I'm not saying I love every other example you gave of it, but here it works. Okay, I think. Okay, so let's move into volume 5, which is called Scott Pilgrim versus the Universe. Scott and Ramona's relationship has begun to deteriorate as Scott begins to believe that she may still be interested in Gideon. While Scott fights a robot created by Ramona's twin exes, Kyle and Ken Katayanagi, Knives tells Ramona that Scott dated them both at the same time. Ramona confronts Scott over his infidelity and tells him he is another evil ex waiting to happen. The twins kidnap Kim. Scott is about to lose the fight but emerges victorious when Kim lies and says that Ramona texted her. Scott returns to Ramona, who tearfully bids Scott goodbye and fades away. A short time later, Scott receives a phone call from Gideon, who asks him if he has time to die. Okay, so I really like this issue. I thought it was cleverly set up where you see Ramona being very jealous. She's learned about some of the stuff from Knives, and she's just jealous of Scott's sort of wandering eye that he definitely has. And she's starting to doubt the relationship, and things start falling apart, which like creates this tension, right? Like we've invested all this time in this couple, and we don't want to see it fall apart, you know? So there's all this drama about it. And then, it ends with him at his lowest point. She leaves. So I thought this was a really good volume, and I was really excited to get into volume 6. But what did you think of this one?
I liked that Ramona was removed from the equation at some point, and it was about like Scott, although he had to save Kim, I thought it was cool that it had something to do with Kim rather than Ramona. And, to have another character, a female character, be kidnapped for Scott to save is kind of
happened several times, yeah. It continues to happen, yeah.
But that aside, it was nice to see, like, Kim sort of being invested in their in Ramona and Scott's relationship at that point, and so showing, like, where she is at with in terms of all the things that have gone on between her and Scott, and for her to try to like, get him... the moment that she tells Scott, like, yeah, Ramona knows you can do it or whatever, he gets fire in his eyes and he goes crazy and he like defeats them. And that's like the motivation he needed. Something else I did want to say was the party at the beginning. The going to the parties
wearing
was kind of fun.
Costumes. Again, like I kept thinking about the artist going like, I want to like draw them in different costumes. Like it had to be fun, right? To have these characters you've created and dress them up. I don't know. That's just not something like I would think about that much in writing.
And there are some characters that we haven't really touched too much on, like Scott's sister. And there was another, there's Julie, I think her name is. She's dating like.
That's whose house they go to for the parties. She's the one who, she's.
Some of these characters are just like fun and quirky, and like they're like sort of in the story, and those characters tended to like give nice flavor when it became stale with sort of just Scott or Ramona.
Yeah. Steven Stills is the one who's dating Julie, I want to say, for a while.
And they break up at some point.
Julie's kind of considered to be like this like cold, like, he calls her a bitch in the comic. And But she also hosts all these parties, and I did like the detail of her moving into this like flat, this apartment that is like way swankier than anything else we've seen them be at, and it just felt really appropriate again to me of that like transitory part of your life where all of a sudden you go from like hanging out in someone's bedroom to now you're in this like apartment that someone has for the first time, and they're of course throwing a massive rager, like you know what I mean, like
right.
It's funny.
And then everybody just goes to that house because that's the nice house, and everybody wants to
although
hang
I
out
was
there.
like, who's
Sense.
someone's gonna call the police on them for making too much noise with these robot fights.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought this whole I felt like this really represented a transition within the story itself. Like it was shifting into another gear. It was moving into the end game of the story. And again, I was definitely engaged. And then we move into volume 6. So volume 6 is called Scott Pilgrim's Finest Hour. 4 months have passed since Ramona's disappearance. In order to reinvigorate Scott, Wallace sends him on a, quote, wilderness sabbatical to Kim's home in northern Ontario. The trip prompts Scott to remember that he never actually saved Kim from being kidnapped. The revelation prompts Nega Scott again to emerge. Though he initially wishes to defeat Nega Scott in order to forget his relationship with Ramona, he instead merges with Nega Scott, thus remembering and accepting responsibility for his poor actions in his previous relationships. Scott returns to Toronto to fight Gideon at his newly opened club where Envy is making her solo debut. Gideon invites Scott to join the League of Evil Exes. When Scott refuses, Gideon kills him with the power of Love Sword. Scott awakens in a desert where he encounters Ramona. They reconcile, and Scott uses his extra life to return to the club where he confronts Gideon inside Ramona's subspace and encourages Ramona to overcome Gideon's influence. When Scott witnesses Gideon berate Envy, he realizes he has been no better than Gideon in his past relationships, causing him to gain the power of understanding. Scott and Ramona unite, defeat Gideon together, and decide to give their relationship another chance. In an epilogue, Scott works as a coach chef with Steven, who reveals he is gay and dating Joseph. Scott and Kim start a new band, and Knives leaves to attend university. Scott and Ramona affirm their desire to face the challenges of a relationship together and walk hand in hand into a subspace door. Okay, that's the end of issue 6, which might be my favorite issue. And I have a lot of respect for someone who is able to find a good ending for something that they've been working on for as long as, Bryan Lee O Malley was working on this series. It's tough to do. And I felt like he stuck the landing here. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it was satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. He took the words out of my mouth. This is my favorite volume, and he totally stuck the landing. Because if I can see a version of the story where he doesn't, and it, the rest of it is sort of, it's not to take away from anything he would have done, but if the ending isn't as satisfying, we can look back at some of these other volumes and be like, oh, it wasn't, overall the story wasn't quite as satisfying as I would have liked, but the art in this is by far the best.
I noticed that too.
Some of the moments in the desert, some of the moments of when they're fighting Gideon in the subspace, all that stuff looks extremely cool. Very well thought out. And then like this idea of like these things have consequences, and people coming to understandings, and Scott understanding like he was a piece of shit, because he clearly was the entire story. So like we said, like that creates that full circle narrative where like he's a piece of shit in the beginning, and he might be relatable to you because you've been that piece of shit, but you can eventually come to an understanding and ask forgiveness and be a better person going forward.
Well, and I loved how it was tied to like he had to remember. He couldn't just ignore the things he'd done. He had to face them. And I think there's even a point where he says like, but I hate myself, and I'd rather forget than face that. That's not exactly what he says, but to that effect when he's talking with Kim. And he does have to learn that he needs to recognize what he's done, remember it, and learn from it, which is a difficult, painful thing to do, to like wrestle with the mistakes we've made, the people we've hurt, and actually change, like work to change versus just ignore and move on, which seems to have been his MO, thus far.
I do want to talk about the fighting in this, because I feel like we've talked about it a little bit, but something we've talked about how this is very influenced from shonen manga and shonen anime, but there's like theories that I've read up on and listened to mangaka talk about, where there's like a certain flow to a certain page and the way that the panels flow together. In specifically this issue too, I was noticing like Bryan O'Malley really keying in on like the things that make that sort of flow of panels in a fight scene work really well, because it's where your eye is drawn, right? So it's like it might start, the first thing that's going to catch your eye is like it's something near the left, usually in America. So near the left, and then the image will slowly like pull your gaze to other parts and the way that it'll flow. And you can kind of have like, you know, Scott punched somebody here, and then it flows to the next panel, like down and to the right, and then it'll flow to the next one and become like a whole splash page sort of action spread. And I always find that sort of kinetic fight scene stuff in some manga and comics like this to be really fun, because there's another version of it where it is sort of like in film where you get a shot and then you cut to a punch, and then you cut to this, and you keep doing all these like rapid cuts, and they're just like sort of like stationary still things. And this sort of feels more like blocking of a scene and the flow of how you might move the camera and how kinetic it can be.
Yeah, that's all kind of stuff too that is kind of invisible until you like mention it to me, because when it's working, you kind of don't even notice it. You kind of just are in it, right? Like you're feeling the excitement of the moment. The splash art is really cool, and it feels massive. It feels like a big moment. And then, yeah, you turn the page and there's only one image or something that's like, oh, this is really big, and
right.
When he gets killed, like I think there's like 4 pages of white before you get anything else. Like
that was crazy too. Like that's a huge decision to make. That's like, we're gonna have a bunch of pages in this book that have nothing on it, and then the editor's like, what the fuck?
Yeah,
can't you just do that?
Yeah,
with
there's
one?
so many little cool flares like that. I remember there's a point in an earlier issue where Scott is like yelling insults out of the bus as it's like driving away from Wallace, I think. And the insults and the bus get smaller and smaller and smaller as like panels shrink and shrink and shrink, and it's like illegible at a certain point. I thought that was really clever.
I spent a lot of time trying to like key in. I was trying to like really zoom in with my eyes to see if I could read it.
It's really fun, and like there's a part where like he's chewing, he's got something in his mouth and he's chewing, so like the text gets all garbled and you can't quite read it. There's like just playing with the panels themselves get like shrunk at certain parts. There's a moment where someone's like stepping out of a panel. I think their foot is like coming out of it and stuff too, which almost gives it like a 3D effect. So there's just so much fun he's having with this form, and he's being very playful with it. And that kind of stuff was just as interesting as anything else to me. Like, what is the next little trick he's going to pull? It was a joy every time. Yeah,
and each of those is like, that's an inspiration of art too. Like that's so much time spent thinking about like the exact things that you want to do and the reasons for doing them. And yeah, I think that stuff's so cool.
I had forgotten about the extra life. I remember it happening, and like and then like when it happened, I was like, oh yeah, I think that's the thing in the movie too. But like, even when it happened, I was like, well, this is going to be important later. Remember that. And then he got killed, and I swear to God, I forgot. And I was like, how are they going to bring him back? And then it was like, oh yeah, you have an extra life. And I was like, God damn it, how did I forget? Of course he has the extra life. That was like, so it's funny that it worked, because it was like 3 issues back. It was just long enough to where it, because I read them over the course of several days, so I had kind of forgotten about it.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's what Bryan O'Malley was hoping for.
Exactly.
On a repeat, like, you're going back through the story in one medium or the other, and you forgot that. That's perfect.
There is a lot of overlap with this and Wade Watson, I think about it. Not to spoil what happens in Ready Player One, but yeah. You remember what I'm talking about?
Sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah. Like I said, I don't know who influenced who or what, but
Ready Player One came out later than this, I can tell you that.
Yeah,
and this is absolutely the kind of thing that I could see Ernest Cline reading and liking. So I don't know. Sure. I wonder if he's ever talked about it. But like, yeah, I can definitely see some influence here. I'd be surprised if there wasn't, at least. So what do you think of Gideon, the big bad, and this final confrontation? They're in this like epic club, which is really swanky and just very unlike any place we've been so far in this comic series.
There's been some teasing of, we've gotten his name, we've seen his face a few times, but they had to very quickly be like, you hate this guy. So they set up this sort of like, he's trapped, literally iced these women, like literally like these characters have literally been frozen. And one girl at one point says like, I was frozen since 2003 or something. So it's like, how, I don't know. Was it 2010? Was that actually 7 years that she was frozen?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that, I mean, very quickly they were like, you need to hate this character, and you know, he seemed somewhat threatening, but pretty quickly they beat him pretty fast, I guess.
Yeah.
And
yeah, but I think the more important thing, and honestly, I found Gideon to just be like whatever. But I think there, you know, Scott is supposed to be seeing some of himself in this character, and some of his worst tendencies like turned up a notch in this character. And when he gets invited to become a member of the League of Evil Exes, I think it really drives home how much Scott doesn't want to become like him and like these others. But one of the things I thought worked best about this was all the stuff going on with Ramona and how she had to be the one to cast him out of the subspace, which is apparently like her subconscious. And it couldn't, like, Scott could not defeat him there. It had to be her. And I thought that was like profound in a way too, about truly moving on from someone. Like, someone else can't make you move on from someone. You have to do that yourself. And she had work she had to do still. And I think that's something that a lot of times people like Ramona forget, or that's difficult, painful work, and they don't want to have to deal with it. So I think it's telling that at the end, her bag gets burst open, and her literal baggage, whatever, like her emotional baggage is spilled everywhere. And I think Scott says, like, should we like pick this all up? And she's like, no, I wanted to get rid of it anyway. And it's, you know, figuratively and metaphorically here, to getting rid of baggage, getting rid of her emotional baggage at the same time.
Yeah.
I did also like how we see Scott sort of intersect with most of the major women. We didn't really talk about Lisa, who was a pretty significant character for a while. And she's not here at the end, but Envy, Kim, Knives, all get a moment to like have a final sort of interaction with Scott leading up to this, and then even a little bit of resolution at the end. And I liked all of that. And Envy, again, continues to be an interesting character. And she's the one who's like dating Gideon at the time. And then again, it feels like Scott kind of helps her out by like exposing just how much of an asshole this guy is. And she's, you know, able to ascend to her stardom because like everybody loves her and she's awesome. And she's this like huge pop star basically at this point. I don't know. She's a really interesting character too.
I can't wait to get to the movie just because of everybody who's in this movie and who plays all these characters and stuff. What a cast.
Well, that's the thing, man. I was looking at some of the cast from that movie and I could not believe
insane.
it.
It's like, insane. I mean, Brie Larson, like early Brie Larson.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like the tip of the iceberg, honestly. The cast of that movie is incredible.
For sure.
Okay, so speaking of Stephen E., who commissioned this, he actually wrote a comment for us, and I thought we could sort of address it here. And in fact, he touches on something we've already touched on a little bit. He says, do you think Ready Player One is borrowing anything from Scott Pilgrim vs. the World? Also, do you find the overarching storyline to be an allegory for overcoming the emotional baggage people bring with them from past heartbreak? Or do you find the story to be stuck in the male bravado accompanying the video game culture of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s? Is the balance of art, music, and creation properly handled?
I feel like a couple of them we've talked about, right?
Yeah.
So
that's kind of been at the heart of what we've been discussing, I think, right?
Yeah. The Ready Player One has been addressed. I think that, like you said, if we look at the dates, I'm sure there were other people who were doing this sort of thing. I will say it's not just Ernest Cline and Bryan O'Malley. There are other people who are doing this sort of like nerd culture referencing heroes sort of thing. And then what was the next?
Is this an allegory for overcoming emotional baggage from past heartbreak, or do you find it to be stuck in the male bravado accompanying video game culture? Kind
of both.
It's both. I would agree. Like it is that, and it is stuck in that, but it's deliberately so. That's also just kind of the window dressing for the story. Once I got around to the point where I recognized the emotional core of this story and what it is really dealing with, again, like I went on a journey with this, and by the end, I'm a fan of it. Like, I actually really like it, but I was not there at the beginning. I didn't think I'd get there.
Yeah.
And I did like the movie. I remember liking the movie, so I'll be very interested to revisit it. But the comic, I was like, I don't know about this. But by the end, I was on board, and I actually really thought there was some profound stuff here, especially as I still don't like Scott Pilgrim as a person. I came to have an affection for him, I guess.
Yeah. We talked about the baggage is basically, it's literal, but it's also the allegory. Like you said, the nearing the end, what Ramona goes through. And then the male bravado stuff like that's, I mean, and something else that I kept thinking about was this is like the almost like getting to the peak of like gatekeeping nerd culture, and like that there was that time period where like it was like, especially, and even we talked about in Ready Player One.
Yeah. Comicsgate was a massive thing, like shitstorm.
Yeah, and this idea of like gatekeeping the knowledge and like being like the know-it-alls and being the people who would like
what makes a true fan, a true nerd,
exactly,
a true, whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's really shitty, nasty stuff, honestly. And we definitely don't support gatekeeping of any kind. Like, if you like comics, congratulations, you're a comic fan. You ever watched a Star Wars movie and liked it? Congratulations, you're a Star Wars fan. Like, it's like the fucking gatekeeping is ridiculous.
It's wild.
Yeah, but anyway, we are getting in the weeds a little bit here. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. We are going to be back next week with the Edgar Wright film, which I am very excited about. And then we'll be making a vote on which is the best version of this story. Which I don't know where I'm going to land, honestly. I'm going to have to give the movie a shot, because I thought it was going to clearly be the movie, but I ended up really enjoying this. I'm having a lot of fun covering comics, so keep them coming as far as like the recommendations go.
Yeah, I'm excited to cover some more comics. I'm very excited to get into the movie. Edgar Wright's a very inspirational filmmaker to me. I genuinely just love everything he's made.
I'm expecting you to bring it next week, man. I want to find out why you like Edgar Wright, what it is about him in this movie, all that stuff.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool.
Guy's a wealth of knowledge. He's one of those filmmakers that's like he's created his own style. He's like pushing forward the art form. Like I can't wait to talk about it.
That's awesome. So if you wanted to support us, if you wanted to vote on a project like we talked about earlier, definitely check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/inktofilm.
Another way you could support this podcast is by leaving a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen. The Apple Podcast being the place that most people go.
It's the gold standard. Yeah, if you enjoyed this coverage, also tell a friend. Like, if you know somebody who likes Scott Pilgrim, likes this kind of stuff, let them know. Word of mouth is another great way. If you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe. And if you are on social media, connect with us. We are at Ink2Film on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and love to connect with you on there. All right, man, I feel like I've leveled up. I've gotten equipped, and now I'm ready to do battle with the movie. I don't know. The metaphor's falling apart.
I've attained understanding. So
yeah, there you go. The power of understanding.
I get +2. I liked all the +2s and +1s and proficiencies, and it's just fun. Yeah, it's just fun stuff.
All right, we'll be back next week, and until next time,
thanks for listening.